The gun was real, the hammer was cocked, and the man holding it was 3 whiskeys past the point of reason. That's the moment nobody talks about when they reminisce about Rio Bravo. Not the songs, not the swagger, not the iconic poster that became one of the most reproduced images in Western film history. The moment they don't talk about is the one that almost ended everything, before the cameras even had a chance to roll on one of Hollywood's most beloved classics. And the only reason Dean Martin walked off that set alive, with his easy smile still intact and a cigarette still dangling from the corner of his mouth, was because of the man who moved with the quiet, terrifying certainty of someone who had spent decades learning exactly when to act and when to wait. John Wayne didn't wait. But to understand what happened on that dusty Warner Brothers backlit on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon in 1958, you have to go back further. You have to understand who these men were before they became legends. You have to understand the strange alchemy of talent and trouble and sheer reckless ambition that brought them all together on a single film set, in a story so dangerous and so human that it had no business ending the way it did, with everyone still breathing. Because not everyone expected it to. Rio Bravo didn't begin with a script. It began with an argument. Specifically, it began with the particular fury of a man named John Wayne watching a movie he considered a personal insult and deciding, with a stubborn, volcanic conviction that defined everything he ever did, that he was going to make something better. The movie that lit the fuse was High Noon, the 1952 Gary Cooper Western that critics adored and audiences worshipped, and that Wayne, privately and then very publicly, considered an absolute disgrace. Not because of the filmmaking. The filmmaking was impeccable, but because of what the story said about courage, about community, about what it meant to be a man when the moment of truth arrived. In High Noon, Gary Cooper's sheriff begged for help. He went door to door through a cowardly town, hat in hand, asking people to stand with him against the killers coming on the noon train. And nobody came, and Cooper faced him alone. And critics called him a masterpiece of tension and moral complexity, a film that said something true and uncomfortable about human nature. John Wayne called it something else entirely. He said the story made him physically sick. He said a real lawman, a real man, would never degrade himself by begging. He said the whole premise was un-American, a word he used with the conviction of a man who had spent his career embodying a particular vision of masculine virtue so completely that the line between the character and the man had long since dissolved. So he called Howard Hawks. Howard Hawks was the director John Wayne trusted more than any other human being on Earth, which was saying something, because Wayne trusted almost nobody completely. But Hawks had directed Red River, and in doing so had pulled from Wayne a performance so raw and complex and unexpected that it had genuinely surprised people who thought they already knew exactly what John Wayne was. Hawks understood something about Wayne that most people missed. He understood that beneath the monument, beneath the icon, there was an actor, a real one, capable of doubt and darkness and unexpected grace. And he understood how to use that. Wayne called Hawks and said he wanted to make a Western that answered High Noon. Not a sequel, not a remake, not a commentary. An answer. A story about men who didn't ask for help, who handled their own problems, who stood together not because they were begged, but because they chose to. Hawks listened to the idea and said yes, almost immediately, because Hawks had been thinking something similar, and because the two men shared a vision of what movies could be and what they owed their audience. What neither of them could have predicted was the cast they were about to assemble. Because the cast of Rio Bravo wasn't so much chosen as it was conjured, a collection of personalities so combustible, so particular, so individually brilliant and individually difficult, that putting them all in the same place at the same time was either an act of genius or an act of madness. And for several weeks in the summer of 1958, it was genuinely unclear which one it was. Dean Martin was not supposed to be in this movie. That sounds strange now, looking back, knowing what the role became for Martin's career. Knowing that dude, the recovering alcoholic deputy sheriff, is still considered by many critics to be the finest dramatic performance of Martin's life. But in 1958, Dean Martin was not a dramatic actor. He was a singer. He was a comedian. He was a relaxed, luminous half of a comedy duo that had recently and very publicly exploded, leaving Martin to rebuild a solo career with the casual efficiency of someone who appeared to be doing everything effortlessly, even when nothing was effortless at all. The split with Jerry Lewis had been brutal in ways that the public didn't fully understand. Lewis was the one people expected to survive it. Lewis was a performer, the physical genius, the one who controlled the room. Martin was a handsome one, the one who stood there and looked good and let the funny man do his thing. That's what people said. That's what people believed. And Martin had listened to enough of it over enough years that part of him had started to wonder if they were right. They were not right. But Martin didn't know that yet when Hawks came calling. What he knew was that he needed something to prove. To the industry, to the audience, and to the quiet, persistent voice in his own head that had been asking uncomfortable questions ever since the night the act ended and the lights came up, and he was standing alone in the middle of his own life, wondering what exactly he was made of when nobody was watching. Hawks saw something in Martin that almost nobody else had bothered to look for. He saw a man who had spent his entire career performing ease, performing calm, performing the comfortable illusion that nothing really mattered and everything was fine. And he understood that a man who was that good at performing those things must have had to work very hard to become good at them. He understood that somewhere beneath that famous smile and those bedroom eyes and that voice that moved through a room like warm water, there was something harder and more complicated, something that had earned the ease by surviving things that weren't easy at all. He offered Martin the role. Martin said yes before he finished reading the script. He said later that he knew immediately, in some part of himself he didn't usually consult, that this was the part he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it. But Martin came with complications, not personal complications. By all accounts, Martin was one of the most professionally reliable people on the Rio Bravo set, one of the most prepared, one of the most focused. The complications were chemical. Martin was a drinker, not a catastrophic, life-destroying drinker. Not the kind of drinker who missed calls or forgot lines or showed up unable to function, but a drinker in a way that many men of his generation and background were drinkers, steadily, sociably, with a particular ease of someone for whom alcohol had always been part of the landscape of life, as natural and unremarkable as weather. And on a film set that was already populated with outsized personalities and running on the compressed tension of a tight schedule and a vision that had to be executed exactly right, that drinking became a kind of pressure point. Nothing dramatic, nothing that stopped production, but a background hum of watchfulness from the people who care enough about the film and about Martin to pay attention. John Wayne paid attention. This is the thing about Wayne that people miss when they flatten him into the monument, the icon, the image, the political symbol that everybody argued about for decades. The thing they miss is that he was, in certain crucial ways, an extraordinarily attentive human being. He noticed people. He watched them. He had the particular social intelligence of someone who had spent decades navigating complex power structures and difficult personalities in an industry that chewed people up with cheerful indifference, and he had developed a radar for trouble that was calibrated to a frequency most people couldn't even hear. He watched Dean Martin with protective attention of someone who understood, perhaps better than Martin himself did in those early weeks, exactly what was at stake, not just for the film, for the man. And then there was the rest of them. Ricky Nelson was 21 years old and famous in a particular way that only people who have been famous since childhood can be famous, completely naturally, without the self-consciousness that comes with wanting it, because he had never known anything else. His father was Ozzie Nelson. His mother was Harriet Nelson. His entire life had been broadcast on American television since he was a child, and he had grown into his fame with the relaxed grace of someone who simply accepted the world as it presented itself and found most of it fairly pleasant. He could not act. Not at first. This was apparent to everyone on the set within approximately the first 15 minutes of the first day of shooting, and it created a problem that Howard Hawks solved with characteristic pragmatism by simply building the limitations into the character. Colorado, the young gunfighter Nelson played, became a man of few words not because the script demanded it, but because fewer words meant fewer opportunities for the limitations to show. And what Nelson lacked in technique, he made up for in something that couldn't be taught, a natural ease in front of the camera that came from having been in front of cameras his entire life, a quality that somehow translated as authenticity even when performance around it was uncertain. Walter Brennan was the wild card. Brennan had 3 Academy Awards, which was a record nobody else had matched, and he had particular freedom of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone and had therefore stopped trying. He did exactly what he wanted on that set, exactly how he wanted to do it. And what he wanted was to create one of the most memorably irritating characters in the history of the Western genre, Stumpy, the cantankerous, toothless, endlessly complaining old jailer who provided most of the film's comic relief and somehow, in the hands of three-time Oscar winner operating at full creative liberty, became something genuinely affecting. Brennan was 74 years old that summer. He had seen everything. He was afraid of nothing. And he watched the dynamics of that set with the detached amusement of someone who has lived long enough to find human chaos more entertaining than troubling. Which brings us to the extras. Every large-scale Western production in that era relied on a particular class of performers. Men and women who showed up day after day in costume, who filled the background of saloon scenes and street scenes and crowd scenes, who contribute the essential texture of a world without ever being central to the story. Many of them were veterans of dozens of Westerns, men who had spent their careers in the margins of Hollywood's most beloved genre, who knew how to ride and how to draw and how to stage a convincing brawl, and who had developed, over years of this particular kind of work, a relationship with the props of the Western that was intimate in ways that sometimes created its own kind of danger. The props of a Western set in 1958 were not what they would become in later decades, when the industry's relationship to firearms on film sets had been reshaped by tragedy and liability and the hard lessons of experience. In 1958, on a major studio Western, real guns appeared on set with a regularity that would seem almost unimaginable today. Period-accurate revolvers, authentic antique firearms, weapons that were supposed to be modified for blanks but that sometimes, in the chaos of a working set, were not checked as carefully as they should have been. The assumption was professionalism. The assumption was that everyone on the set knew the rules and followed them and understood the difference between a prop and a weapon. The assumption was not always correct. The man's name has been deliberately obscured by history, which is itself a kind of statement about what happened and how the people involved chose to handle it afterward. He was a day player, an extra, one of the men hired to fill the background of a saloon confrontation sequence that Howard Hawks was staging in the middle of a long afternoon of shooting. He had been on Western sets before. He knew the territory. And he had been drinking, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone had caught and addressed, but enough to soften the edges of judgment, enough to blur the line between a role he was playing and something older and more personal, enough to make him, when the sequence began and the adrenaline of performance mixed badly with the whiskey in his blood, reach for the gun at his hip with an intention that was no longer entirely theatrical. Nobody saw it happening until it was already happening. Dean Martin was positioned at the bar of the saloon set, a beautiful, detailed recreation of a Western drinking establishment, all dark wood and amber light, and the smell of sawdust and something sweet and chemical underneath that was a particular perfume of movie set trying to smell like the past. Martin was in character as Dude, which meant he was inhabiting a man at the lowest point of his life. A man whose hands shook when he wanted a drink he knew he shouldn't take. A man whose pride had been dismantled by addiction and who was in a fragile, difficult process of trying to put it back together. Martin had been working on this character for weeks, and what he had built was something genuinely moving. A portrait of a man fighting his own nature with a particular combination of dignity and desperation that only works when the actor has found something true in himself to put in the character's place. People who were on that set have said that watching Martin work in those weeks was like watching someone discover a room in themselves they didn't know existed. He was fully present, fully committed, completely there. He was also, in that particular moment, facing away from the man with the gun. The sequence called for a confrontation between a group of antagonists and the lawmen in the saloon. Standard Western staging. Men on both sides of conflict, a moment of escalating tension. The particular choreography of threat and counter-threat that Hawks had refined across dozens of films into something that felt spontaneous and real even when it was precisely planned. The extras knew their marks. The principals knew their lines. The cameras were rolling. And then something changed. Later, the witnesses would struggle to articulate exactly what was they noticed first. Some said it was the way the man moved. Something slightly off in the quality of his motion, a looseness that didn't belong in a stage confrontation. Some said it was a sound, the particular metallic sound of a hammer being drawn back on a real revolver, a sound subtly different from the sound of a prop weapon being handled, a sound that registered somewhere beneath conscious thought and produced a cold, immediate alertness in the people who heard it. Some said they simply saw his eyes, the particular quality of focus in them, or rather the particular absence of the right kind of focus, the way they were fixed on Dean Martin with an intensity that had nothing performative in it. What everyone agrees on is what happened next. John Wayne moved. It happened with a speed that everyone who witnessed it remembered as shocking. Not because Wayne was particularly fast in a way that the movies had trained him to expect, not with the theatrical quickness of a gunfighter from a script, but with the immediate, purposeful speed of a man who had assessed the situation and committed to a response before most of the people in the room had even finished registering that there was a situation. He crossed the distance between himself and the man in the kind of time that doesn't feel like time at all, that compresses into a single moment of motion. And he had the man's wrist in his grip before the arm had fully extended. The grip was not violent. That's the detail that the witnesses kept returning to, the detail that lodged in their memories and stayed there. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't a tackle, a lunge, a dramatic physical intervention, the kind that looks good in movies because it has been designed to look good. It was simply a hand, large and certain and utterly calm, closing around a wrist at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way, with the quiet authority of someone who has never in his life been uncertain about what he intended to do. The gun did not fire. The hammer came down on empty air, because Wayne's other hand had found the cylinder and controlled it in the same motion that secured the wrist, a maneuver that spoke of an understanding of firearms that went far beyond what most actors ever needed to develop, an understanding that Wayne had built over 30 years of working with real guns on film sets and hunting trips, and a particular kind of masculine culture that surrounded him throughout his entire adult life. He knew guns the way a craftsman knows his tools. Not romantically, not theatrically, but practically, in the bone-deep way of someone who has handled them constantly enough that the knowledge lives in the hands rather than in the mind. He took the weapon. The man stood there, swaying slightly, the empty moment where the gun had been now suddenly full of particular quality of air that settles over a room after something terrible has almost happened. Around them, the saloon set had gone completely silent in the way that movie sets almost never go completely silent. The background of machinery and conversation, and 1,000 small sounds of production and motion had simply stopped, replaced by something that was not quite silent so much as it was a held breath of 30 people simultaneously understanding that they had just been very close to something irreversible. Dean Martin turned around. He had not seen what happened. He had heard it. The sound behind him, the commotion, the sudden absence of the sounds that had been there a moment before, and he had turned with the unhurried movement of a man who had learned, over a lifetime of navigating dangerous rooms and difficult people, not to react to things before he understood them. He turned and he looked at John Wayne, and he looked at the man whose wrist Wayne was still holding, and he looked at the gun in Wayne's other hand, and something moved across his face that was not quite fear, and not quite shock, and not quite relief, but was something in the complicated territory, where all three of those things live when they arrive at the same moment. He said something. The accounts differ on exactly what he said, which is itself revealing. It means that the people who heard it were focused on so many other things simultaneously that the words didn't lodge with the same precision as the image. Some accounts say it was something casual, something in Dean Martin's particular register performed nonchalance, a line that acknowledged what had just happened, while also maintaining the fiction that he was absolutely fine, that nothing had touched him, that the easy smile was as natural and unearned as it had always appeared. Some accounts say he said nothing at all for a long moment, that he simply stood there and looked at Wayne with an expression that said everything that didn't need to be said. What is agreed upon is what happened after. Howard Hawks called cut. He called cut in the particular tone that film directors use when a situation has moved beyond the boundaries of what could be managed through the normal apparatus of production, and he walked onto the set with the quiet, controlled authority that defined his entire career. Hawks was never a director who shouted, who performed his authority for an audience, who made himself the center of a drama. He was a man who addressed problems with the same measured competence he brought to everything else, and he addressed this one the same way. The man was removed from the set, quietly, without the kind of scene that would have embedded itself more deeply in the memory of everyone present, without the dramatic confrontation that the situation might have seemed to demand. Someone, accounts differ on who, walked him off the lot, and the production took a break that lasted slightly longer than the scheduled breaks usually lasted, long enough for people to collect themselves, long enough for the adrenaline to move through the room and dissipate, long enough for a particular suspended quality of the moment to settle back into something that resembled normal. John Wayne sat down. This is the detail that people who were there remember most clearly, more clearly even than the motion that had preceded it. He sat down in a way that men sit down when they've been running on pure instinct, and the instinct has finished its work, and the body is reclaiming itself in the state of complete readiness that instinct requires. He sat in one of the chairs that lined the edge of the saloon set, and he looked at the gun in his hand for a moment, and then he sat down on a nearby surface with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something that deserves to be handled carefully, and he looked up and found Dean Martin still standing there, still watching him. What passed between them in that look is something that neither man ever discussed publicly in any great detail. Wayne was not a man given to discussing his feelings in public, or in private either. If the people who knew him are to be believed, Martin had constructed an entire career on the premise of not taking anything too seriously, at least not in any way that showed, and he was not about to abandon that premise now, in front of 30 witnesses on a movie set in Burbank. So whatever was exchanged in that look was exchanged privately, between two men who understood each other in a particular way that people understand each other when they have shared a moment that could have gone very differently. But the people who were watching them say that something shifted in that moment. Something in the relationship between the two men, which had been warm and professional and built on mutual respect, deepened into something that doesn't have a clean name, something that had been tested and had held, something that Martin, for the rest of his life, would carry with him in a particular way that people carry the memory of moments when they understood, without sentimentality and without exaggeration, that someone had shown up for them when it mattered. The production resumed. This is the thing about movies, about the particular insanity of making them. They resume, no matter what has happened, no matter how close things have come to going wrong in ways that can't be fixed. The machinery of production reasserts itself, because the schedule is the schedule, and the budget is the budget, and there are people and equipment and a vision that needs to be realized, and the only way to realize it is to keep going. Hawks called the set back to order with the same calm efficiency he had used to clear it, and the cameras rolled again, and the actors found their marks, and the scene continued. But something was different now. Something had changed in the chemistry of that set in a way that was subtle but unmistakable to the people who were paying attention. The incident, which is what would always be called afterward, the incident, with a particular vagueness that people use when they want to acknowledge something without giving it the weight it would acquire if they named it directly. The incident had done something to the relationship between the cast members that no amount of rehearsal or preparation or shared creative vision could have produced. It had made them real to each other in a way that performance alone never quite manages. Dean Martin came to work the next day with the same easy smile and the same practiced nonchalance and the same cigarette and the same unhurried movement through the world that had always characterized him. But people who knew him well, people who had been watching him long enough to read the signals beneath the performance, noticed something different, a quality of attention, a quality of presence, as if the near miss of the day before it cracked something open in him had made the work matter in a way that was more immediate and more personal than it had before. His performance in the scenes that followed has been described by everyone who was there as the best work of his career. And the scenes that followed were the most demanding ones. The scenes where Duke confronts his own weakness and his own need and his own complicated relationship with the self-destruction he has been courting for years. The scenes where the character's hands shake and his pride bleeds and he has to choose, consciously and repeatedly, between the easier path and the harder one. Martin played those scenes with something that went beyond technique. He played them with the truth of someone who had spent the previous day facing, in a very literal and unambiguous way, the fact that the world could simply end without warning, without preparation, without giving you the chance to get ready for it, or to say the things you should have said, or to become the person you had been planning to become when you got around to it. He played them with the knowledge, fresh and unprocessed and still sharp as a cut, that someone had stood between him and the worst possible outcome. Not because they were obligated to, not because there was anything in it for them, but simply because they saw what was happening and they moved. John Wayne watched those scenes with the same quiet attentiveness that had characterized his relationship to Martin from the beginning of the production. He watched and he didn't say much, because Wayne's particular form of approval was almost always expressed in silence rather than words. A nod, a presence, the quality of attention that people who mattered to him had learned to read as something warmer and more significant than it might appear to someone who didn't know what they were looking at. Howard Hawks watched those scenes and said nothing either, because Hawks was a director who understood that the greatest gift you can give a performance happening in front of you is to simply not interrupt it. He let the cameras roll longer than the script required. He let Martin find his way through material at the pace the material demanded, without the usual pressure of coverage and schedule, and the 100 small practical concerns that compete with pure performance for a director's attention. He gave Martin room, because he understood that what was happening in front of him was something that could not be manufactured and could not be repeated and should not be interfered with. The film that resulted from those weeks, from the vision and the chaos and the accidents and the near disasters and the strange, unrepeatable chemistry of that particular group of people in that particular place at that particular moment, is still considered one of the finest westerns ever made. Not because of its plot, which is comparatively simple. Not because of its action, which is staged with Hawks' characteristic precision, but isn't particularly abundant. It endures because of its people, because of the quality of life that inhabits every scene. The sense that these are real human beings navigating real problems with real resources and real limitations, and that the camera is simply present to document what happens when they do. Dean Martin's performance as Dude won him no awards. This is one of the great failures of the award-giving apparatus of that era, a failure that film scholars have been noting with varying degrees of outrage ever since. The performance is extraordinary. It is detailed and physical and emotionally precise in a way that requires both courage and craft in equal measure, and it was produced by a man who had been told, implicitly and explicitly, for most of his professional life, that he was not an actor in any serious sense of the word. He proved them wrong so thoroughly that the argument became unanswerable, and the people who had made it simply moved on without acknowledging that they had been wrong, because that is what people do. John Wayne received notices that recognized him as commanding and authoritative and charismatic, which were all true and all deserved and also somehow inadequate to what he actually did in that film, because what Wayne did in Rio Bravo was not simply perform. He created a context. He created a world in which the other performances could find their fullest expression, because he understood that the most powerful thing a star can do is not to command every scene, but to provide the gravitational field that allows everything around him to organize itself correctly. The film works because Wayne's chance is a fixed point around which everything else rotates, and the certainty of that fixed point gives everyone else the freedom to be uncertain, to be complicated, to be human. That understanding of his role, of his responsibilities, of what the work actually required from him, was not something Wayne could have articulated in those terms. He was not an actor who discussed his craft in theoretical language, but he embodied it completely, in every scene, in every interaction with his fellow performers, and in one unrehearsed, unplanned moment on an afternoon in Burbank when the theory and the practice came together in a way that had nothing to do with the film and everything to do with the man. The story of what happened on that set circulated through Hollywood with the quiet persistence that the best stories always have, not the dramatic, headline-generating version, because the people involved actively discourage that version, but the whispered, passed-along version that lives in the memories of the people who were there and the people they told about it over years and decades of dinners and parties and industry gatherings, where the real history of movies gets transmitted in the way that all real history gets transmitted. Personally, imperfectly, with a particular warmth of something that actually happened to someone you actually know. What it said about Wayne was not surprising to the people who knew him well. It confirmed what they had always believed about him, what his closest collaborators had been saying for years in the face of the cultural argument about what he represented and what he stood for, and whether that was good or bad, or some complicated mixture of the two. It confirmed that whatever else was true about John Wayne, and a great many things were true, some admirable and some not, as is the case with every human being who lives long enough and publicly enough to accumulate a real biography. What was also true was that he was someone you wanted beside you when something went wrong. Not because he was infallible, not because he was without complexity or contradiction, but because when the moment came, he was there fully and immediately and without hesitation, in the way that very few people ever managed to be there for anyone. Dean Martin understood this. He understood it in the immediate, embodied way that you understand something when it has been demonstrated to you in terms that admit no ambiguity, not intellectually, not abstractly, but in the particular grammar of the physical world. The grammar of motion and proximity and the warmth of hand closing around a wrist at the moment when a wrist most needed to be held. He carried that understanding with him for the rest of his life. The two men remained close, not in the performed, industry friendship way of people who appear together at events and speak warmly about each other in interviews, though they did that too, but in the quieter, more substantial way of people who have been through something together and know it. Wayne attended Martin's performances. Martin returned the loyalty in kind. They made another film together, The Sons of Katie Elder, 6 years later, and the dynamic between them on that set was described by everyone who observed it as something different from the usual relationship between two major stars sharing a marquee. Something more settled, more certain, the particular ease of people who have already passed the test. The gun that Wayne took from the man on the Rio Bravo set was never returned. What happened to it afterward is not documented in any record that anyone has been able to find. It exists now only as an absence in the story, a detail that might seem like an oversight, but that feels, the more you think about it, like something deliberate. Like someone made a decision about that gun and what it represented and chose to let it disappear, to not give it the weight of an artifact, to not allow it to become a prop in someone else's retelling of a story that was not theirs to tell. The film itself became the artifact. It was released in January of 1959 and became one of the highest grossing films of the year, which surprised almost nobody who had been paying attention to what Hawks and Wayne had been building. Critics divided on it in the way that critics divided on everything Wayne did in that era. Those who loved him loved it completely, and those who had already decided what they thought about Wayne found ways to qualify their admiration. But audiences went in enormous numbers, and they kept going, in the way that people keep going films that give them something they didn't know they needed until they felt its absence. What audiences were responding to, without being able to name it, was a quality of life that the incident had helped to create. The particular texture of relationships between people who had been through something real together, who had established in the most unambiguous terms possible what they were capable of and what they were willing to do for each other. That quality cannot be scripted or directed into existence. It can only be earned, and the price of earning it is exactly the kind of thing that happened on that Burbank set on that afternoon. The kind of thing nobody wanted to go through, and everyone was shaped by, and none of them would ever entirely leave behind. Ricky Nelson, who was 21 years old and had never been through anything remotely like it, and who handled the incident with the particular resilience of someone too young to fully understand how close things had come, later said that Rio Bravo was the experience that taught him what it meant to be a professional. He said it in interviews without elaborating on the specific incident, because the specific incident was not his story to tell. But the education he was describing was real, and it was the education of watching men who knew what they were doing handle a moment that required everything they knew. Walter Brennan watched the whole thing with the detached wisdom of his 74 years, and apparently said very little about it, either in the moment or afterward. But people who knew Brennan said that he seemed, in the weeks following the incident, to be watching Wayne with a quality of attention that was slightly different from how he had watched him before, more interested or more confirmed in something he had already suspected, or simply more aware of the dimension of Wayne that most people never got to see, because most people were never in a position to see it. It is a dimension that doesn't appear in the documentaries and the retrospectives and the cultural arguments about what John Wayne meant and what his legacy is and how we should feel about him now. It is a dimension of the man who was simply there when he needed to be there, who moved without hesitation toward the thing that needed to be addressed, who held a wrist at the right moment, and controlled a cylinder and stood between someone he respected and something that was about to be irreversible. That dimension does not resolve the complexity. It does not answer the arguments or settle the debates or make the parts of Wayne's life and career that are genuinely difficult to defend any less difficult to defend. Human beings are not resolved by their best moments any more than they are defined by their worst ones. The truth of a person is in the full record, the accumulation of choices over time, the pattern that emerges when you step back far enough to see all of it. But the full record includes this. The full record includes an afternoon in Burbank when a man with a gun and 3 whiskeys in his blood raised his arm toward Dean Martin, and John Wayne moved, and the world that existed on one side of that motion was different from the world that existed on the other side of it. And everyone who was present understood that they were living in the difference. Dean Martin finished Rio Bravo and went on to build a career that nobody who had dismissed him in the Lewis years could have predicted or explained. He became one of the most beloved entertainers in America, not because he became someone different from who he had always been, but because the world finally caught up with who he had always been. The ease that looked like laziness revealed itself as grace. The nonchalance that had seemed like disengagement revealed itself as a form of wisdom. The smile that had always been the first thing anyone noticed became understood as the product of a man who had decided, through genuine experience and genuine reflection, that life was worth the effort of finding it beautiful. He never talked publicly about what happened on that set, not in a way that would have made the story his centerpiece, his defining anecdote, the thing he reached for when he wanted to demonstrate what he was made of. That wasn't his way, and it wasn't necessary. The evidence was in everything he made afterward. Endued, specifically, in the performance that had emerged from those weeks on that set, which anyone who wanted to understand Dean Martin in full would eventually need to reckon with. The performance ends with a scene that people still talk about. Dude, having chosen himself, having chosen the harder path at every point where the choice was offered, stands in the sunlight outside the jail and does something that had been denied him throughout the entire film. He stands straight, not demonstratively, not with any theatrical emphasis, just straight. The way a man stands when the weight he's been carrying has been set down, when the long struggle has resolved itself into something that can be lived with. It is a small thing, physically. On screen it lasts perhaps 3 seconds. And it is devastating in the way that only true things are devastating, because it earns everything it costs, and you feel the cost. John Wayne was off camera when that moment was filmed, because his character had already left the frame. But he was on the set. He was watching. And the people who were watching him watch said that he was very still and very quiet, and that his face had the particular expression of someone who is seeing exactly what they were hoping to see and has the discipline not to make it about themselves. That is the whole story. That is the thing that happened on the Rio Bravo set, and the thing that didn't happen because of it, and the thing that happened in the film because of what didn't happen, and the thing that stayed with everyone who was there for the rest of their lives, in the way that the moments when things could have gone terribly wrong and didn't tend to stay with people, quietly, persistently, without drama, like a second heartbeat you don't notice until you stop to listen. The gun was real. The hammer was cocked. And the man who moved faster was exactly the man you would want to move faster, in exactly the way you would want to move, which is to say, without thinking about it, without calculating the cost, without asking anything in return, just moving, because that was what the moment required. And because some people, when the moment comes, simply do what the moment requires. That's the story. That's the whole story. And the reason it endures, the reason people keep telling it, keep finding their way back to it through the decades of cultural argument and revision and the complicated accounting of legacies, is not because it resolves anything. It is because it is true, because it happened, because one afternoon in Burbank, in the summer of 1958, on a wooden saloon set that smelled of sawdust and chemical sweetness, with cameras pointed at a world that didn't exist, something happened that did exist, permanently and without qualification, in the real and irreplaceable record of what human beings are capable when the moment is real and the need is genuine, and someone who can act decides to act. The rest is cinema.